Hi and welcome to another episode of Delaware County Political News, Meet the Expert. I am your host, Larry DeMarco, and we are here with part 2 with Jodine Mayberry. If you have not seen part 1 of her interview, please watch that first before watching this interview. What are the social disparities among the changing political landscape of Delaware County from this early 20th century time right up to the end of the 20th century?
Wow. Well, I'm not sure I can talk so much about the beginning of the 20th century. I do know that there were a lot of blacks in Chester, a lot of Irish, Italians, Polish in Upper Darby, and then towards the end of the 20th century, now into the 21st century, Upper Darby became a huge magnet for immigrants from Latin America, from India, and the Asian subcontinent. And right now in Upper Darby, they like to brag that they have people from more than 60 nations, and they have kids in school whose first languages, more than 50 first languages. And then there was a little tiny town of Milburn right next to Upper Darby, is almost completely Asian subcontinent, Pakistanis, Indians, and they've all become, all of the political offices are filled by immigrants. It's kind of a neat little town right there. Upper Darby is, it has so many different nationalities and cultures in Upper Darby, and Upper Darby is slowly changing from solid Republican to Democrat as a result of that.
What happened to Chester in the 1970s in terms of industry and population?
It's very sad, very sad. Chester gradually lost all of its industry. Ford Motor Company, places like that, Sunship, they all closed down. And at the same time, they were running I-95 through Chester, completely separating the more affluent parts of Chester from the less affluent parts and from the business district, so that the white population fled, and this Chinese wall highway has made it impossible for Chester to, I think, to ever bounce back. On the affluent side, you have Crozier Hospital, and you have Widener University, and of course, don't forget that there was the whole urban redevelopment era of the 1960s, where so many buildings, so much was torn down and never replaced. And you drive through Chester, you can see just empty lots. Philadelphia has bounced back, and new people have moved into Philadelphia, and it's become a very vibrant area again. I don't think that's ever going to happen for Chester. I don't see how. It's too small, and it's just, I don't know, I think it's kind of hopeless.
Well, but how about that rich resource of all that water, the ports,
yes,
the location of where Chester is in terms of highway and transportation access, closest to the city? Why such a pessimism for such place with potential?
Yes, well, they spent 30 years building the Blue Route, which is named because they had 3 or 4 cross-county routes, proposed routes. I think there was I'm sure there was a red and a yellow. I don't think there was a green, but there might have been. And the red and the yellow was out in the western part of the county. But they settled on the Blue Route, and they said the Blue Route is going to mean the revival of Chester. It's going to bring traffic right down into Chester. And Chester has had a little bit of redevelopment. It has the casino, it has the prison, it has the soccer stadium. But when you look at all of those things, they're completely isolated from the population. People don't leave the soccer stadium and go to nearby restaurants. The same thing with the casino. You can actually get to the casino and the prison without ever really passing through Chester. So when they built the stadium, they promised they were going to have build $400,000 townhouses, and they were going to build little shopping strips and things like that. That was going to be phase 2 after the stadium. Well, the stadium came along in 2008. The economy tanked, and we have never heard another word about those townhouses and stores, and we never will. So, it just hasn't. Even though the river is there, the infrastructure is there, it still can't seem to get off the ground.
What have been the patterns of development over the past 20 years?
Okay, well, let's go back. Let's go back to 1974 when the 2 malls were built on either end of Media. That was going to destroy Media, but they didn't. And Media has survived the actual coming and going of the Granite Run Mall, which is now going to become mixed housing and stores. A lot of it for senior citizens. And
Media outlasted the Granite Run Mall.
It did. Media, yes, it did. And Media keeps reinventing itself. It's been, it was a wonderful shopping area with a lot of little gift shops and things like that. And now, since the townhouse closed, and there are many of us who mourn the closing of the townhouse, it's reinvented itself as a restaurant mecca. There are 4 Mexican restaurants in Media. 4. No, we never thought we'd see that. And in the meantime, the western part of the county, which had remained Quaker farms and undeveloped, is now really taking off. In Concord, you have the Concord Town Center, you have Brinton Lakes, and you have Maris Grove, this gigantic over 55 community. So there, and now you see the medical centers are creeping out there. You have Penn Medicine all over the place. You have Children's Hospital. There's 2 actual new Children's Hospital
campuses,
facilities on Baltimore Pike. One in Concord and one right there in Media by Granite Run. So that's and look at my little town of Brookhaven. We've just gotten a whole complex with a giant and a new liquor store. All these wonderful rateables. Places like Brookhaven and Concord are fat city with rateables.
A gym there.
The gym, yes, the gym. A new Lowe's. And we're very hopeful of having a chain restaurant like perhaps Chili's come in. So from the middle of the county on out is really developing now.
How has the population shifted, and how is that significant?
Well, at one point, Delaware County was 90% white. Now it's about 81% white. And, Delaware County was a beneficiary of a lot of the white flight from Philadelphia. So what we have is some very, very affluent communities. I'm thinking of Radnor, Swarthmore, even Springfield to some extent, with Marple, Newtown. All of them have fabulous school districts, and they are high income, so they have the money to support their schools, whereas the river communities, or the communities that border Philadelphia, like Yeadon and Darby, are largely black, largely poor. They have very poor school districts. You have the Southeast Penn, you have the William Penn, You have the Chester Upland School District. All of them, they don't have the ratables to support a good educational system. And so those districts really have to depend on getting aid from the state to be able to provide educations for their kids. And you will notice that the only place where we have charter schools are in those poor districts. A Swarthmore or Radnor will never allow a charter school. They already have their private schools, of course, the Episcopal Academy and places like that. But that's how that goes.
Jodine, you've been writing in politics in the Delaware County and Philadelphia area for about 40 years, but you're also a historian about the Delaware County area. Tell us about politics for the past century or so.
Okay, so what I know about Delaware County politics is that in the 1850s, the Republican Party was formed, the Abolitionist Party was formed basically out of the old Whigs, and it has been absolutely, totally Republican ever since. We have not elected a Democratic judge in this county since the 1850s. So the Republican Party ran the county primarily out of Chester, because remember, Chester was the population center of Delaware County for many decades. So, you know, and a number of bosses came and went. Then in the around the turn of the 20th century, we started having the McClure family, and there was a McClure before John McClure, but John McClure is the famous Republican that's remembered in Delaware County. He established a party machine that was second to none, and didn't necessarily do it to reward leaders, but through his own lieutenants. In the 1930s, right in the very early 30s, right around 1930, he was a bootlegger, and he and about 12 other people were put on trial for bootlegging, and were convicted. And John McClure, the big political boss in Delaware County, was about to go to jail when Prohibition ended, and the federal government sent out an edict that to stop prosecuting bootleggers, and so he got out of going to prison. But he continued to have absolute control over the party. He established something called the War Board, which was the county commissioners and a few other people who ran the party with an iron hand. And here's a fun thing: when voting machines came into the county, McClure realized that he could not gimmick the voting machines, but he had several ways of making sure that people voted Republican. First of all, they paid people to vote Republican, and so someone,
which is illegal, of course.
Of course, it's illegal, of course. So people would go into the polling booth, and they would have smeared rouge or oil on the Democratic lever, and then when they came out, a party boss shook their hand and got ready to pay them. But if there was rouge or oil on their hand, they didn't get paid. So they'd used a lot of other gimmicks too. They put up voting machines so that so they could be viewed from, say, the second story of a window across the street. Or I have a friend who grew up in Chester. She and her sister were the only registered Democrats in Chester. And so the Republican Party would come to them and say, if you will change your registration and vote Republican, we will send you to the community college. That's how closely they tried to control things.
And they meant it too, right? It was
And
a
they
sincere
meant it.
offer.
Oh, yes, it was. Yes, it was. Yeah. And John McClure. Well, so at some point, and I'm not sure exactly when this point was, the county commissioners started to have to elect a minority member. There were 2 majority and 1 minority member. So they had to elect a Democrat. So McClure recruited a whole bunch of what they call McClure Democrats. So he actually paid them to vote for their hand-picked minority member. The term McClure Democrats lives on today. And there probably are still a lot of people alive who were McClure Democrats, who were really Republicans.
In 1950s, there was a scandal about the Chester Water Authority. Tell us about that. Yes, the
Public Utility Commission was about to create the Chester Water Authority for free. McClure decided that he was going to buy the Chester Water Authority through, other people, and he got other people to buy the water authority, buy the bonds, and then immediately turn around and sell the bonds to another one of his stooges, and supposedly he made a profit of about $100,000 out of that. He's tried again. He's tried with John Diggins, who became a county judge. And this time, and a couple of other people, and this time he actually got out of it. They acquitted him. So he's continuing to be the county boss. In Chester, there's a series of mayors who are totally beholden to the Republican machine. White mayors. One of the last of which was Jack McCrelly. Now, Jack McCrelly was taking money from two guys, Herman Fontaine and Frank Miller, big mobsters who were running the numbers racket in Chester, and he got caught. He got caught basically because he was trying to control the police and making the police not arrest the numbers runners, and so the FBI came in. They wired up some cops. And they caught him, and they sent him to prison for a few years. And then he gets out of prison, I'm going to say late 70s, and then Joe Battle was his protege. Joe Battle was elected mayor, and so I started covering the county for the Philadelphia Daily News in 1983. Joe Battle is still mayor of Chester. A nice guy. I really liked Joe Battle. So I'm sitting there one day after a Chester council meeting. That was back when the press actually used to cover township meetings and county meetings and all that. And I'm sitting there waiting to talk to him after a council meeting. And I had come from Trenton, which Trenton was probably no slouch in corruption, but for many years, it had a mayor named Arthur Holland, and Arthur, they called him Honest Art because he was so honest. So during my years of covering Trenton, I was used to covering Art Holland. So I'm covering Joe, and one day after this council meeting, a young black man walks up to Joe, and he says to Joe, he says, "Mayor Battle," he said, "I did everything that you asked me to do." He said, "I changed my registration to Republican. I talked to the ward healer that you told me to talk to. I put my application in at the Chester School Board." He said, "What else do I have to do to get a job?" And Joe, without missing a beat, right in front of me says, "You've done everything you're supposed to do. Don't worry about it. Go home, and we will be calling you." And that was my introduction to patronage politics in Delaware County.
Could someone get a job in county government or some of the local townships controlled by the GOP without changing their registrations?
Well, you could get a job if you were registered Republican. Yeah.
Meaning, no, as a Democrat, you had to change your registration.
Right. And even after that sort of died away, people strongly believed that you had to be registered Republican in order to do anything in Delaware County, including get your mother into Fair Acres. And I think people still believe that. But I remember in the early 1980s, when I was registering voters out at the McDade Mall, and every voter was registering Republican. And I called the Democratic leader, Diane Merlino, I think her name was at the time, and I said, Diane, I said, everybody that I'm registering is registering Republicans. She said, oh, don't worry about it. She said, those are our Republicans. They're just registering Republican because they think they have to get a job. But when it comes to the presidential election, they'll vote Democrat. And she was right. From about 1988 on, the county went Democrat in the presidential elections.
But locally, for county elections,
locally, always Republican. And the machine they have is so well oiled. For instance, the county employees have always gotten election day off. There is no reason for them to get election day off. They get election day off to drive voters to the polls, to work at the polls, to hand out literature at the polls. You know, it's outrageous, and it's still outrageous. So, and the one time I covered the county Republican convention, and sitting in the front row, in two or three front rows, were all county employees, all women, and they were sitting there with straw hats and banners. And then at a certain point, when they had nominated whoever they intended to nominate, these women leapt up, and they're marching around the room to the tune of "Happy Days Are Here Again" with signs going, you know. I've never seen anything like that. Never. And I wondered if, and a hell of a lot of them worked in the court support office for Joe Dorsey, who was another famous Republican boss. And I wondered if they were the least bit embarrassed by having to do that.
Jodine, there have been many historical events here in Delaware County, some of them at historic landmarks. Mm-hmm. Please share with us what your research has uncovered.
Okay. Well, there's not been that many historical events here in Delaware County. And in my piece about Delaware County, it was not a piece exclusively about the history, so a lot of things had to be left out. But I did want to mention that one huge event that we had here was the Battle of Brandywine in 1777. It was out there in Chadds Ford between, I think it was between Birmingham and Bethel, in that area. And we were very, very fortunate that the state and local historical societies were able to preserve a part of the battlefield, about 50 acres, which is a part of the battlefield where George Washington and his troops were bivouacked, because the western part of the county didn't develop, so it was still farmland, and there were still the old houses. The house where Lafayette stayed is still there, so they were able to preserve those things, and I would urge anybody to go out and take a tour of the Brandywine battlefield. I do a lot of personal genealogy, and I've traced the number of my Mayberry ancestors back here in Delaware County to the Quakers that came over with William Penn. And one line of them are the Thornberrys, who ended up in Thornbury. They named the place after themselves. And in the Battle of Brandywine, my ancestor, Joseph Thornberry, was an 11-year-old boy who was driving wagons full of supplies to Washington's troops, and was drafted to become a drummer boy in the Battle of Brandywine. Unfortunately, he survived, or, my lineage would be different. And I'm reminded of a piece that I found in one of the Delaware County histories that I used for my research. The History of Delaware County by Henry Ashmead. And he has, which was written in 1884, he has a really breathtaking account of the Battle of Brandywine. And he talks at one point about an old farmer named Joseph Brown, who had to come and fetch Washington to take him to the site where the main battle was going on. And they put this poor old farmer up on a war horse, and he was leading Washington to the battle, and the war horse is jumping over fences and jumping over ditches, and the farmer's hanging on for dear life, and Washington turns around and keeps saying to him, push on, old man, push on, old man. And so Brown finally gets him to the battle site, and once Washington is there, Brown slips off the war horse and disappears into the woods because he doesn't want to have anything to do with it. But if you should get your hands on a copy of Henry Ashmead's book, it's really good. Of course, it ends in the 1880s, but up until then, it's really very good.
There was a great flood in 1843?
Yes. Probably the worst storm throughout the 19th century was this great flood. It was a hurricane, and it hit from all sides, and there was so much water that came down, very similar to what recently happened in Houston, that all of the 4 creeks in Delaware County flooded 33 feet over their banks, wiping out dozens upon dozens of mills, including the Leiper mill, and killing several dozen people. So there were various floods and other weather events after that, but the flood of 1843 was perhaps the most horrendous weather event in the 19th century. I also wanted to mention that the lack of development in the western part of the county has led us to having our great artistic resource, the Wyeth family. There's the Brandywine Museum is out there, and Andrew Wyeth in particular painted scenes of the farms and the fields surrounding the area, which really, if you see his paintings, really gives you a visual picture of what it was like back then out there in the western part of the county.
Jodine, you have given us such a wealth of knowledge, and we know that you have done such extensive research. Can you give us some of your resources? Yes,
and if you would Google Delaware County history, you come to a site that lists all of these things with links so that you can click on them and go to them yourself. 2 of the history books that I used extensively were The History of Delaware County by George Smith, written in 1862, and The History of Delaware County by Henry G. Ashmead, written in 1884. There's a Encyclopedia of Delaware County by Samuel Wiley in 1894, and other books are listed there. If you're a genealogist at all, a lot of these books that I'm mentioning and that are available on this site have a great deal of genealogical information as well as historical information. Of course, the Delaware County Historical Society has all of these materials as well. There are, business directories, a cemetery list, genealogies, family genealogies, archives, Chester County archives if you're interested in that. I would recommend that you go to just Google History of Delaware County, and you'll come to the site, and then you'll be able to look up these things for yourself.
Jodine, we're going to leave it there.
Okay.
But I want to thank you for being a guest on Delaware County Political News.
Well, thank you very much for having me, Larry. I really enjoyed doing this because, you know, I never get to talk about my research to anybody, so I'm glad for this opportunity.
Well, we enjoyed having you, and we hope to have you as a guest again.
Oh, okay. Thank you very much.
We have been here with Jodine Mayberry, and I am your host, Larry DeMarco. If you like this video, please don't forget to like, follow, share, subscribe, and to forward this link to all the contacts on your contact list and Facebook friends. We are signing off. Tune in next time. Bye for now.